A 19-year-old drops out of Stanford. She tells investors she's built a machine that could diagnose hundreds of diseases from a single drop of blood. No needles, no laboratories, no waiting days for results. It sounded impossible. Yet some of the most powerful people in America believed her. Within a decade, her company was worth $9 billion. Presidents praised her. Billionaires invested in her. The media called her the next Steve Jobs. Her name was Elizabeth Holmes. But behind the black turtlenecks, the magazine covers, and the billion-dollar valuation, there was a secret that would eventually bring about one of the biggest corporate frauds in modern history. It all began in 2003. Elizabeth Holmes wasn't running a billion-dollar company. She was a sophomore, studying chemical engineering at Stanford University. But she wasn't interested in finishing her degree. She believed she had something much bigger. So she dropped out. That same year, she founded a company called Theranos, a name created by combining the words therapy and diagnosis. Its promise sounded almost too good to be true. Instead of drawing multiple vials of blood from a patient's vein, Theranos claimed it could perform hundreds of laboratory tests using just a single drop of blood from a finger stick. No large needles, no long waits, no expensive laboratory equipment, just a tiny sample, and almost instant results. If it worked, it wouldn't simply improve healthcare, it would completely redefine it. Routine checkups could become faster. Diseases like cancer might be detected earlier. Patients with chronic illnesses could monitor their health more easily. Reliable diagnostics could become cheaper, quicker, and far more accessible to millions of people around the world. It sounded revolutionary, and that's exactly why investors wanted to believe it. Elizabeth Holmes had an unusual ability to make impossible ideas sound inevitable. She spoke with unwavering confidence. She presented herself as someone driven not by profit, but by a mission to transform medicine and save lives. Over time, she carefully built an image that became just as famous as her company. Black turtlenecks, minimalist presentations, an unusually deep voice. Everything about her echoed the public persona of Steve Jobs, her entrepreneurial hero. To many people, she wasn't just another startup founder. She looked like the next great visionary of Silicon Valley. Then, in 2009, another influential figure entered the story. His name was Ramesh Sunny Balwani. Nearly 20 years older than Holmes, Balwani joined Theranos as its president and invested $10 million of his own money into the company. On paper, they were business partners, but behind closed doors, they were something else entirely. Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani had been in a romantic relationship since 2005. Almost no one inside Theranos knew. Not the employees, not the board of directors, not the investors placing millions of dollars into the company. The relationship remained one of the company's most closely guarded secrets. Together, Holmes and Balwani began chasing a vision that promised to revolutionize medicine. A vision that would soon attract some of the wealthiest investors, the most powerful politicians, and eventually, the scrutiny that would bring everything crashing down. By 2013, it looked as though Elizabeth Holmes had done the impossible. Theranos secured a landmark partnership with Walgreens, one of America's largest pharmacy chains. Soon, sleek Theranos wellness centers began appearing inside Walgreens stores across Palo Alto and throughout Arizona. The promise was astonishing. Walk in, prick your finger, leave with the results of more than 200 laboratory tests, all from a few tiny drops of blood. No large needles, no lengthy appointments, no waiting days for a laboratory report. And according to Theranos, it would all be faster, cheaper, and more convenient than traditional testing. To the public, it felt like the future of medicine had finally arrived. The media couldn't get enough. Magazine covers celebrated Elizabeth Holmes as Silicon Valley's newest visionary. Television interviews praised her bold ambition. Then came one of the biggest endorsements of all. Forbes estimated her personal fortune at $4.5 billion, making her the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. Theranos itself was valued at an astonishing $9 billion. The company seemed unstoppable. Holmes was invited to global conferences alongside world leaders. She became one of the most recognizable faces in technology. And the company's board of directors read like a list of America's political elite. Former Secretaries of State George Shultz and Henry Kissinger joined the board. So did former senior military officials and influential statesmen. They weren't laboratory scientists. They weren't medical researchers. But their reputations gave Theranos something almost as valuable as working technology: credibility. To investors, partners, and the public, those names suggested that people at the highest levels had already done the hard questioning. Few stopped to ask whether anyone on the board actually understood the science behind the company's extraordinary claims. But behind the polished presentations, behind the billion-dollar valuation, and behind the carefully crafted image of revolutionary innovation, a very different story was unfolding. Inside Theranos' laboratories, employees were discovering a problem that couldn't simply be explained away. The company's flagship device, the compact machine it claimed could perform hundreds of blood tests from a single fingerstick, was struggling to do what it promised. Test after test produced unreliable results. Some employees raised concerns. Others questioned whether the technology was ready for patients at all. Many didn't stay long. Those who challenged the company's claims often found themselves pushed out, isolated, or bound by aggressive non-disclosure agreements that discouraged them from speaking publicly. And there was something even more troubling. Most patients believed their blood samples were being analyzed by Theranos' revolutionary machine. In reality, many of those tests were quietly being run on modified, industry-standard laboratory analyzers, the very machines Theranos had promised to replace. The company had convinced the world it was reinventing blood testing, but behind closed laboratory doors, it was increasingly relying on the technology it claimed had already become obsolete. For years, Elizabeth Holmes had managed to stay ahead of the doubts. Now, someone was finally asking the right questions. His name was John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Unlike many before him, Carreyrou wasn't interested in Theranos' promises. He wanted evidence. He began speaking with former employees, engineers, scientists, laboratory staff. One by one, they described a company that looked nothing like the polished image presented to investors and the public. The deeper Carreyrou dug, the more the story began to unravel. Then he published his investigation. Its conclusions were devastating. According to multiple former employees, Theranos' proprietary blood testing device, known as the Edison, was unreliable, frequently produced inaccurate results, and was being used for only a small fraction of the tests performed on real patients. Instead, most samples were quietly being processed using modified, industry-standard laboratory analyzers. The very machines Theranos claimed its technology had made obsolete. The company's response was immediate. Theranos denied every allegation. Elizabeth Holmes appeared on national television, insisting the investigation was false. She portrayed the report as an attack by an industry that felt threatened by innovation. For a moment, it seemed like the company might survive yet another controversy. But this time, the story refused to disappear. Instead, it spread. As headlines multiplied, patients began sharing their own experiences. One man underwent 3 separate Theranos tests measuring his prostate-specific antigen, a key marker used to screen for prostate cancer. 2 of the results came back alarmingly high. Concerned, he sought a 4th test at a different laboratory using a traditional blood draw. That result came back completely normal. Then came an even more disturbing case. A pregnant woman received a Theranos blood test indicating a sudden and dangerous drop in a hormone essential to a healthy pregnancy. The results suggested she might be miscarrying. Having already suffered 3 previous miscarriages, she was devastated. Her doctor immediately ordered another test through a conventional laboratory. The second result told a completely different story. The Theranos test had been wrong. Stories like these transformed the scandal from a business controversy into something far more serious. This was no longer just about investors losing money. It was about patients making medical decisions based on potentially inaccurate laboratory results. Regulators took notice. In 2016, inspectors from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services concluded that Theranos' laboratory practices posed an immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. It was one of the strongest warnings a clinical laboratory could receive. The consequences came quickly. Walgreens, the company's most important commercial partner, terminated its partnership with Theranos. Confidence evaporated. Investors began pulling away. The company, once valued at $9 billion, was now watching that valuation collapse piece by piece. Yet even as the walls closed in, Elizabeth Holmes refused to admit defeat. She continued raising money. She continued defending the technology. And, according to later prosecutors, she continued making many of the same extraordinary claims to new investors, even as the evidence against Theranos continued to grow.
By 2018, the illusion could no longer hold. After years of investigations, mounting evidence, and relentless scrutiny, regulators reached a conclusion that would change everything. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission charged Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos with what it described as massive fraud. According to the SEC, the company had spent years making false and exaggerated claims about its technology, its financial performance, and its business partnerships, all while raising hundreds of millions of dollars from investors who had almost no way of verifying what was actually happening inside Theranos' laboratories. The company that had once promised to revolutionize medicine was now fighting for survival. It didn't survive. Theranos shut its doors. The company, once valued at $9 billion, simply ceased to exist. But the story wasn't over. Federal prosecutors believed the deception went far beyond misleading investors. In June 2018, a federal grand jury indicted both Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Prosecutors argued that Theranos had been built on 2 parallel campaigns of deception. One targeted investors. The other targeted doctors and patients who trusted the company's blood test results to make critical medical decisions. Both Holmes and Balwani pleaded not guilty, but they would not stand trial together. The court separated their cases. Then came one of the most unexpected developments in the entire saga. During her defense, Elizabeth Holmes claimed that throughout their relationship, Sunny Balwani had been psychologically controlling and sexually abusive. She testified that his influence shaped both her personal life and her leadership inside Theranos. Balwani categorically denied every allegation. His attorneys dismissed the claims as false and argued they were being used to avoid criminal responsibility. The jury was left to weigh 2 very different narratives. One portrayed Holmes as the architect of an elaborate fraud. The other presented her as someone manipulated by the man who helped run the company. After months of testimony, thousands of documents, and countless hours of evidence, the jury reached its verdict. In January 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and 3 counts of wire fraud related to defrauding investors. She was acquitted on the charges alleging she intentionally defrauded patients. Months later, it was Sunny Balwani's turn. His trial focused on many of the same events, but the outcome was far more decisive. After deliberating for 4 days, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty on all 12 counts. Investors, patients, conspiracy, fraud.
The company that had promised to change medicine had now become one of the most infamous corporate fraud cases in Silicon Valley history.
On November 18th, 2022, nearly 2 decades after dropping out of Stanford, Elizabeth Holmes stood before U.S. District Judge Edward Davila for sentencing. The promises that had once captivated Silicon Valley had been replaced by years of investigations, courtroom testimony, and overwhelming evidence. Before the sentence was handed down, prosecutors offered one final assessment of the case. At every critical moment, they argued, Elizabeth Holmes had been given a choice. And at every fork in the road, she chose deception. Judge Davila sentenced her to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. 3 weeks later, Sunny Balwani entered the very same courtroom. He stood before the same judge, faced the same evidence, and heard an even longer sentence: 12 years and 11 months in federal prison. The court concluded that Balwani had been aware of serious problems with Theranos' technology and had continued pushing the company's claims despite those failures. Together, Holmes and Balwani were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution to the investors they had defrauded. In April 2023, Balwani surrendered to federal authorities. A month later, in May 2023, Elizabeth Holmes began serving her sentence. The company that once claimed it would transform healthcare no longer existed. And the machine that had made Elizabeth Holmes a billionaire on paper never delivered what she promised. Not reliably, not consistently, not in the way the world had been led to believe. For more than a decade, almost nobody outside Theranos' walls knew the truth. The black turtlenecks, the carefully lowered voice, the Stanford dropout story deliberately echoing Steve Jobs. None of it happened by accident. It was all part of a carefully constructed image. An image powerful enough to persuade billionaire investors, former secretaries of state, Walgreens executives, and countless patients who trusted their health to a company they believed was changing medicine forever. The technology failed, but the story succeeded. For years, belief proved more powerful than evidence. And that belief built one of the most valuable startups in Silicon Valley history, until reality finally caught up. Because in the end, Theranos wasn't built on revolutionary technology. It was built on trust. And once that trust disappeared, everything else disappeared with it.